The sound of handcuffs clicking shut echoed across the once tranquil Montgomery Park. A few joggers slowed their pace, their eyes narrowing in curiosity, while a woman walking her dog froze mid-step. Standing by a police cruiser, Officer Lucas Bradley tightened his grip on the cuffs around a man's wrists. "You're making a big mistake," said the man, his tone calm, almost too calm for someone in his position. He was Ethan Wallace, a tall, composed man dressed in a navy blue sweatshirt and jeans, his presence understated yet impossible to ignore. Despite the restraint, his posture was relaxed, his sharp eyes fixed on Lucas with unnerving steadiness. Officer Bradley, a 15-year veteran of the force, shifted uneasily. "If you're innocent, you've got nothing to worry about." His words were firm, but the slightest tremor betrayed his uncertainty. Ethan didn't flinch. Instead, a small, knowing smile tugged at the corner of his lips. "Do you even know who I am?" Lucas hesitated, his grip tightening on his belt. "That doesn't matter. Suspicious behavior in a public park gives me reason to act." Ethan raised an eyebrow, his gaze unwavering. "Suspicious, huh? Reading a book alone on a bench? What exactly do you think I've done?" Lucas opened his mouth to respond, but the murmurs of onlookers and the weight of Ethan's calm confidence left him momentarily speechless. For the first time, he questioned his instincts. Just as Lucas started to speak again, Ethan leaned forward slightly, his voice low but cutting. "Let me give you a hint. You're about to find out the hard way that appearances can be deceiving." And with that, Ethan allowed himself to be led into the back of the cruiser, his calm demeanor casting an air of authority that Lucas couldn't quite shake. The officer slid into the front seat, started the engine and drove away, leaving the whispers of the parkgoers behind. What did Officer Lucas just get himself into? Who exactly is Ethan Wallace? Stay with me as we unravel this story of mistaken identity, prejudice, and one shocking revelation. The cruiser hummed along the winding streets as Officer Lucas Bradley stole glances at the man sitting silently in the back seat. Ethan Wallace's expression was unreadable, his eyes fixed on the scenery flashing by. For a moment, Lucas found himself wondering if this was the kind of man who could truly be a criminal. But the doubt didn't linger. He clung to his gut instinct, the one that had served him well for years, reminding himself why he had acted in the first place. As they approached the station, Ethan finally broke the silence. "You've made up your mind about me already, haven't you?" Lucas tightened his grip on the steering wheel. "My job is to act on suspicion, not to make personal judgments." Ethan chuckled softly. "And what exactly made me suspicious? My skin color? Or the fact that I didn't leap to hand you my ID the second you asked for it?" Lucas's jaw tightened, but he didn't respond. The truth hit closer to home than he was willing to admit. When they arrived at the station, Lucas led Ethan inside, his grip on the man's arm unnecessarily firm. The tension in the air was palpable as officers and staff turned to watch. Officer Karen Doyle, seated behind the front desk, raised an eyebrow as Lucas approached. "Another one, Bradley?" she asked, her tone laced with sarcasm. Lucas ignored her, handing over Ethan's ID. "Suspicious behavior in Montgomery Park," he muttered, as though reciting a prepared line. Karen glanced at the ID, and her demeanor shifted almost imperceptibly. She looked back at Ethan, recognition flickering in her eyes. "Lucas," she said slowly, "I think you'd better take him to Captain Monroe." Lucas frowned, confusion creeping into his expression. "For a routine booking?" Karen leaned forward, her voice low. "Trust me, this isn't routine." The unease Lucas had been suppressing all afternoon surged forward. Without another word, he guided Ethan down the hall toward the captain's office. As they walked, Ethan's calm confidence remained unshaken. "You might want to think about apologizing before this gets any worse for you," Ethan said, his tone almost conversational. Lucas ignored him, though his stomach churned. He knocked on the captain's door, his knuckles rapping harder than intended. "Come in," Captain Monroe's voice called out from inside. Lucas opened the door, stepping in with Ethan close behind. Captain Monroe, a seasoned woman in her late 50s with a no-nonsense demeanor, looked up from her desk. Her sharp eyes darted to Ethan, and for the briefest moment, her expression softened with recognition. "Ethan Wallace," she said, standing from her chair. Her tone carried a weight that Lucas didn't understand. "Captain," Ethan replied with a polite nod. Lucas frowned, glancing between them. "You know him?" Captain Monroe's gaze shifted to Lucas, her expression hardening. "Officer Bradley, step outside for a moment." "But Captain, now," she snapped, her tone leaving no room for argument. Reluctantly, Lucas stepped out, closing the door behind him. He paced the hallway, his mind racing. Who was Ethan Wallace? Why had Monroe reacted that way? The questions multiplied with each passing second, and with them, a growing sense of dread. Inside the office, Monroe turned back to Ethan. "I'm sorry about this, Ethan. I wasn't aware you were in town." Ethan sighed, his calm exterior slipping slightly. "It's not your fault, Captain, but situations like this are exactly why I'm here." Monroe nodded knowingly. "And Bradley?" "He's green in more ways than one," Ethan replied. "But I don't want to see him fired. Not yet. Let's see if he's willing to learn." The captain's lips pressed into a thin line. "I'll handle this. You'll be free to go in a moment." As Monroe stepped out of the office, Lucas stopped pacing and looked at her expectantly. She folded her arms, her gaze piercing. "Bradley, do you have any idea who you just arrested?" she asked, her voice low and deliberate. Lucas shook his head, though the pit in his stomach told him he wouldn't like the answer. "Ethan Wallace," Monroe began, "is a high-ranking investigator with the Department of Justice. He's here in an official capacity, and you just handcuffed him for reading a book in a public park." The words hit Lucas like a freight train. His face paled, and his lips parted as though to respond, but no words came out. "Take off his cuffs and apologize," Monroe ordered. Lucas nodded stiffly, returning to the office to find Ethan waiting patiently. With trembling hands, he removed the cuffs, mumbling a strained, "I'm sorry." Ethan straightened his wrists, meeting Lucas's gaze. "You're sorry now," he said evenly. "But the question is, what are you going to do to ensure this doesn't happen again?" Lucas couldn't answer. He simply watched as Ethan left the station, his figure disappearing down the hallway. In the silence that followed, Lucas felt the weight of his actions settle over him like a heavy shroud. But this wasn't the end. Not for Lucas, not for Ethan. This was only the beginning of a much larger reckoning. What happens next? Can Lucas confront the biases that led to his mistake, or is his career as a police officer at its breaking point? Share your thoughts in the comments below, and don't forget to subscribe for more stories from Elderly Wisdom. Lucas sat at his desk that night, long after the station had emptied out. The fluorescent lights buzzed faintly above him, and the paperwork for Ethan Wallace's arrest sat untouched in front of him. He stared at the empty lines, his pen hovering uselessly above the page. Captain Monroe's words replayed in his mind. "You just handcuffed a high-ranking investigator from the Department of Justice." The weight of his mistake pressed on him like a vice, squeezing out every ounce of pride he had once carried as a police officer. But it wasn't just the embarrassment of arresting the wrong person. It was Ethan's words, calm, deliberate, and cutting, that gnawed at Lucas. "What are you going to do to ensure this doesn't happen again?" Lucas didn't know the answer, and that terrified him. The next morning, he woke with a pit in his stomach, and the echoes of restless dreams still clouding his mind. The day at the precinct was quieter than usual. Karen at the front desk barely acknowledged him, and the whispers from other officers trailed him like shadows. Word traveled fast, and Lucas was no longer the officer everyone looked up to for his instincts. Now he was the one who had messed up big time. Captain Monroe called him into her office just after noon. Her expression was unreadable as she gestured for him to sit. "Bradley, I've spoken with the DOJ and Wallace directly," she began, her tone clipped. "He's decided not to pursue formal action against you or the department. For now." Lucas exhaled, a brief moment of relief washing over him. But Monroe wasn't finished. "However, he's made it clear that he expects significant changes, starting with you." "Me?" Lucas asked, his voice shaky. Monroe leaned forward, her gaze sharp. "Ethan Wallace is a reasonable man, but he's not a forgiving one. He believes in accountability, and frankly, so do I. Starting tomorrow, you'll be enrolled in an intensive training program focused on de-escalation and implicit bias. You'll also attend community outreach events where you'll listen to the very people your actions impact every day. Lucas bristled. Captain, don't, Monroe cut him off. This isn't up for debate. You made a mistake and now you need to own it. This isn't just about saving your career, Bradley. It's about being the kind of officer this community needs. Her words stung, but Lucas nodded, his throat tight. That evening, as he sat in his small apartment, Lucas opened his laptop and began researching the training program he'd be starting. The descriptions of sessions on cultural awareness and systemic injustice felt overwhelming. He closed the laptop, leaned back, and stared at the ceiling. For the first time, he let the full reality of his actions sink in. He hadn't just embarrassed himself, he had disrespected a man who had done nothing wrong. And if Ethan hadn't been who he was, what could have happened? The thought sent a chill down his spine. The following week, Lucas attended his first community outreach event. It was held in the basement of a local church, where a diverse group of people gathered to share their experiences with law enforcement. Lucas sat at the back, his presence barely acknowledged, as person after person stood and recounted stories of fear, frustration, and sometimes outright abuse. At first he wanted to defend himself, to point out that not all officers were like that. But the more he listened, the more he realized how often those very words were used to dismiss real pain. When the floor was opened for questions, Lucas hesitated before standing. "My name is Lucas Bradley," he began, his voice uneven. "I'm a police officer here in town, and a week ago, I made a serious mistake. I arrested a man in a park because I thought he was suspicious. He wasn't. He was just reading a book." The room grew quiet as every eye turned to him. "I can't undo what I did," he continued, his voice gaining strength. "But I'm here because I want to understand how I can do better. How we, as officers, can do better." An older woman in the front row nodded slowly. "You start by listening, Officer Bradley, really listening." Ethan Wallace had been keeping tabs on Lucas's progress, though he hadn't reached out. That changed 2 weeks later when Lucas received an unexpected call. "Officer Bradley." Ethan's voice came through the line, calm and measured as always. Lucas straightened in his chair. "Mr. Wallace, I didn't expect to hear from you." "I've been hearing good things," Ethan said. "The community seems to think you're taking this seriously." "I am," Lucas replied earnestly. "I know I can't fix everything overnight, but I'm trying." There was a pause on the other end of the line before Ethan spoke again. "Would you be willing to sit down with me? I think we have more to discuss." When they met at a small coffee shop later that week, Lucas felt a knot of nerves twist in his stomach. Ethan greeted him with a polite nod and gestured for him to sit. "I wanted to talk about what happened," Ethan began, "not to rehash the past, but to make sure you understand what that moment meant." Lucas nodded, his expression serious. "I do, or at least I'm starting to." Ethan leaned forward slightly. "It wasn't just about you and me. It's about what you represent when you wear that uniform. People like me have been fighting to be seen as equals for generations. Your actions that day, they weren't just a mistake. They were a reflection of something bigger, something systemic." Lucas swallowed hard. "I understand that now." Ethan studied him for a moment before speaking again. "Good. Because this isn't just about making amends. It's about making sure no one else has to go through what I did. Are you ready for that responsibility?" Lucas met Ethan's gaze and nodded. "Yes, I am." As they shook hands, Lucas felt a strange sense of clarity. He couldn't undo his mistakes, but he could choose how to move forward. Over the following months, Lucas Bradley immersed himself in the process of unlearning and rebuilding. The community outreach events became a regular part of his schedule, and while they were often uncomfortable, they also became the foundation for his growth. Each story he heard added a layer of understanding that had been missing for so long. At one of these gatherings, Lucas sat quietly as a young man named Andre shared his experience of being stopped and frisked multiple times in his own neighborhood. "They say, you fit the description, but what they really mean is, you fit the stereotype," Andre said, his voice thick with frustration. Lucas felt a pang of recognition. That was exactly what he had done to Ethan. Later that night, Lucas approached Andre. "Thank you for sharing your story," he said. "I know it's not easy to talk about, but hearing it matters. It's helping me see things differently." Andre looked him up and down, skepticism clear in his eyes. "Words are easy, officer. It's what you do with them that counts." Ethan Wallace, meanwhile, was making his own moves. His position within the Department of Justice gave him a platform, and he intended to use it. He met with Captain Monroe to discuss broader changes at the precinct, including mandatory implicit bias training and a community review board to oversee complaints against officers. Monroe, though initially defensive, began to see the value in Ethan's proposals. "We can't fix what we don't acknowledge," she admitted during one of their meetings. Ethan nodded. "Accountability isn't about punishment, it's about progress, and progress starts with listening." One of the initiatives they implemented was a ride-along program, allowing community members to observe officers on duty to foster transparency. Ethan suggested Lucas as one of the first participants, much to the officer's surprise. "I thought you'd want to avoid me," Lucas said when Ethan brought it up. "On the contrary," Ethan replied with a faint smile. "I think you're exactly the person who needs this." The first ride along took place on a chilly morning. Ethan sat in the passenger seat of Lucas's patrol car, observing silently as Lucas responded to calls and interacted with the public. At one point, they pulled over a young man for running a red light. Lucas approached the driver's side window, his demeanor calm and professional. "Good morning, sir. Do you know why I stopped you?" The young man, clearly nervous, fumbled for his wallet. I think I ran the light." Lucas nodded. "That's right. Can I see your license and registration, please?" As the young man handed over his documents, Lucas noticed his trembling hands. "Hey, it's okay," he said gently. "I'm not here to give you a hard time. Let's take this one step at a time." Ethan watched the interaction closely, noting the shift in Lucas's tone and approach compared to their first encounter. Later, when they returned to the precinct, Ethan broke the silence. "You're learning," he said simply. Lucas glanced at him, his expression a mixture of relief and determination. "I'm trying." Months turned into a year, and the changes at the precinct began to take root. Officers who once dismissed the idea of bias training now approached it with a willingness to learn. The Community Review Board became a trusted avenue for addressing grievances, and trust between the precinct and the neighborhoods it served started to grow. For Lucas, the transformation was deeply personal. He had come to understand that being a police officer wasn't just about enforcing laws, it was about serving people with fairness and empathy. One evening, Lucas found himself back at the same park where he had arrested Ethan Wallace. This time he was off duty, sitting on a bench with a book in hand. The memory of that day felt distant yet ever present, a reminder of how far he had come. As he read, a familiar voice interrupted his thoughts. "Looks like you've learned to enjoy the simple things," Ethan said, walking up with a coffee in hand. Lucas looked up and smiled. "You could say that." Ethan sat down beside him, glancing at the book. "Good choice," he said, nodding at the title. They sat in companionable silence for a moment before Lucas spoke. "Thank you for giving me a chance to make things right." Ethan took a sip of his coffee, his expression thoughtful. "I gave you the opportunity. You chose to take it. That's on you, Lucas." Lucas nodded, the weight of those words settling over him. "Do you think it's enough? That I've changed enough?" Ethan turned to him, his gaze steady. "Change isn't about arriving at a destination. It's about choosing the right path and staying on it, even when it's hard." As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting a warm glow over the park, Lucas felt a sense of peace he hadn't known in years. He wasn't perfect, and there was still work to do, both within himself and in the system he was part of. But for the first time, he believed in the possibility of lasting change. A few weeks after their conversation at the park, Ethan Wallace invited Lucas to a community town hall meeting he was hosting at a local library. The event, titled Bridging the Gap, Conversations Between Police and the Community, promised to bring law enforcement officers and residents together to discuss their shared concerns. Ethan had made it clear that Lucas wouldn't just be an observer, he would be one of the speakers. The day of the event, Lucas felt a familiar knot of nerves twist in his stomach as he arrived at the library. Rows of folding chairs filled the spacious room, and a large banner stretched across the back wall. "Change begins with understanding. People from all walks of life, Young activists, older residents, community leaders, and off-duty officers milled about, their expressions a mix of curiosity and skepticism. Ethan greeted Lucas near the entrance. "Glad you made it," he said, his tone warm but serious. "I'm not sure anyone here wants to hear from me," Lucas admitted, glancing around the room. Ethan placed a firm hand on his shoulder. "You'd be surprised. People don't want perfection, they want honesty. Just tell the truth." When the meeting began, Ethan stood at the front of the room, commanding the audience's attention with his calm, authoritative presence. He spoke about the importance of accountability, shared his own experiences, and laid out practical ways the community and law enforcement could work together. Then he introduced Lucas. As Lucas walked to the microphone, a hush fell over the crowd. He took a deep breath, gripping the edges of the podium. "My name is Lucas Bradley," he began, his voice steady despite the tightness in his chest. "I've been a police officer for 15 years, and a few months ago, I made a mistake that changed my life." He paused, scanning the faces before him. Some looked wary, others curious, but all were listening. "I arrested a man in this community, Ethan Wallace, because I thought he looked suspicious. He wasn't doing anything wrong. He was sitting on a park bench reading a book. But in that moment, I let my own biases guide my actions, and I treated him unfairly." A murmur rippled through the crowd, but Lucas pressed on. "I'm here today because I've been working to understand why I made that mistake and how I can do better. It hasn't been easy. Listening to your stories, hearing your pain, and facing my own flaws, it's been one of the hardest things I've ever done. But I want you to know that I'm committed to change. Not just for myself, but for this community and for the people I serve." When Lucas finished, the room was silent for a moment. Then, a young woman in the front row raised her hand. "What made you decide to change?" she asked. Lucas hesitated, then glanced at Ethan. "Because someone gave me a chance to see the bigger picture," he said. "Ethan didn't have to sit down with me or guide me through this process, but he did. And that taught me that change starts with conversations like this one. Conversations where we're willing to listen and learn from each other." The crowd erupted into applause, not overwhelming but genuine. It wasn't approval but acknowledgement, a small step toward trust. In the weeks following the town hall, Lucas began to notice subtle shifts in the community's perception of him. Residents who had once avoided eye contact now nodded in greeting. Parents at the park didn't pull their children away when he walked by in uniform. It wasn't a full restoration of trust, but it was a start. Ethan, meanwhile, continued his work on broader reforms. The town hall meeting had inspired other precincts to reach out, curious about implementing similar programs. Ethan invited Lucas to join him on several of these visits, using their shared experience as an example of how personal accountability could lead to systemic change. One afternoon, as they left a meeting at a nearby precinct, Ethan turned to Lucas. "You've come a long way," he said. Lucas nodded, his expression thoughtful. "But there's still so much more to do." Ethan smiled. "That's the point. Change isn't about reaching a finish line, it's about the journey." A year later, the precinct in their community became a model for reform. The ride-along program, town hall meetings, and mandatory bias training had all become permanent fixtures. Lucas, now a vocal advocate for these initiatives, found himself mentoring younger officers, sharing his story as a cautionary tale and a testament to the power of growth. One evening, as Lucas walked through Montgomery Park, he spotted Ethan sitting on the same bench where their journey had begun. Lucas approached, and Ethan greeted him with a smile. "Funny how life comes full circle," Ethan said, gesturing to the empty spot beside him. Lucas sat down, the cool evening air brushing against his face. "If you'd told me a year ago I'd be sitting here like this, I wouldn't have believed you." Ethan chuckled. Change has a way of surprising us. They sat in companionable silence, watching the park's soft lights flicker against the growing dusk. Several months after their quiet moment in Montgomery Park, Lucas Bradley found himself standing in front of a packed auditorium. He adjusted his tie nervously, the sound of hushed voices filling the space. This wasn't the usual precinct meeting or community town hall, it was a regional law enforcement conference. And Lucas was the keynote speaker. The event, titled redefining policing in the modern era, had drawn officers, activists, and community leaders from across the state. Lucas wasn't sure how he had ended up on the stage, but Ethan Wallace had been insistent. "This is your story, Lucas," Ethan had said. "It's not just about what you did wrong, it's about how you've worked to make it right. That's a story people need to hear." Now, standing under the bright stage lights, Lucas scanned the room. Hundreds of faces, many of them wearing uniforms like his own, watched him expectantly. He took a deep breath and began. "My name is Lucas Bradley," he started, his voice steady despite the pounding in his chest. "And a little over a year ago, I made the biggest mistake of my career." He recounted the story, how he had arrested Ethan in Montgomery Park based on nothing more than a gut feeling, a bias he hadn't even realized he carried. He spoke about the fallout, the shame, and the long road to understanding. "But this isn't just about me," Lucas continued, his gaze sweeping across the audience. "It's about the systems we operate within. It's about the training, or lack thereof, that shapes the way we see the communities we serve. And it's about the courage to confront our own blind spots." He paused, letting his words sink in. "For too long, I thought being a good cop meant trusting my instincts. But instincts, as I've learned, can be flawed. They're shaped by experiences, by narratives we don't even realize we've absorbed. And if we're not willing to question those instincts, we risk doing real harm." A ripple of murmurs spread through the room. Some officers nodded in agreement, while others shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Lucas pressed on. "What I've learned is that real policing isn't about power, it's about partnership. It's about listening, learning, and being willing to admit when we're wrong. That's not a weakness. It's the strength our communities need from us." As he concluded, the audience erupted into applause. It wasn't universal. Lucas noticed a few folded arms and skeptical expressions, but it was enough to show that his message had resonated with many. Backstage, Ethan was waiting, a proud smile on his face. "You nailed it," he said as Lucas approached. Lucas exhaled, the tension in his shoulders finally easing. "I wasn't sure how they'd take it." Ethan patted him on the back. "Change doesn't happen overnight, but you've planted a seed. Now it's up to them to decide what they'll do with it." Over the next few weeks, Lucas's speech sparked conversations across precincts and communities. Some officers reached out to him, sharing their own struggles with bias and asking for advice. Others remained resistant, dismissing his story as an anomaly. But Lucas knew change wasn't about convincing everyone. It was about creating momentum. Ethan continued to be a guiding presence, though their roles began to shift. Where Ethan had once been Lucas's mentor, the two now worked as equals, collaborating on initiatives to bridge the gap between law enforcement and the public. They co-authored articles, appeared on panels, and even started a podcast called Behind the Badge, where they shared stories of reform and resilience. One day, while recording an episode of their podcast, Ethan asked Lucas a question that caught him off guard. "Do you ever think about who you were before all this happened?" Lucas hesitated, his hand hovering over the microphone. "I do," he admitted. "And honestly, it scares me. Not just who I was, but how easy it was to be that person, to think I was doing the right thing just because I wore the badge." Ethan nodded thoughtfully. "But that's what makes your story powerful. It's proof that people can change, not because they're forced to, but because they choose to." As the podcast gained popularity, so did their message. Communities across the country began reaching out, asking for advice on implementing similar programs. Lucas and Ethan traveled to cities large and small, speaking with officers and residents alike. Each trip was a reminder of how far they had come and how much work still lay ahead. One evening, after a particularly emotional meeting in a city struggling with police-community tensions, Lucas and Ethan found themselves sitting in a quiet diner. The weight of the day hung heavy in the air as they sipped their coffee. "You think we're making a difference?" Lucas asked, his voice tinged with exhaustion. Ethan set down his cup and met Lucas's gaze. "I know we are, but the real question is, are you ready to keep going?" Lucas smiled faintly, the weariness in his eyes giving way to determination. "Always." Months after Lucas Bradley and Ethan Wallace became symbols of reconciliation and reform, their community faced a new crisis. A viral video surfaced showing a tense confrontation between a police officer and a young black teenager outside a convenience store. Though no physical harm occurred, the officer's aggressive tone and unnecessary escalation reignited fears and distrust within the community. The community was outraged. Protests erupted, with residents demanding answers and accountability. Lucas watched the footage in his small apartment, the familiar knot of anxiety tightening in his chest. He recognized the officer in the video, Officer Scott Mason, a younger cop with a reputation for being overly confrontational. At the precinct the next morning, Captain Monroe called an emergency meeting. The tension in the room was palpable as officers debated the situation. "It's not as bad as it looks," one officer argued. "No one got hurt." "That's not the point," Lucas interjected, his voice steady but firm. "The issue isn't just what happened, it's how it made the community feel. That video confirmed what they've feared all along, that they can't trust us," Monroe nodded. "Which is why we need to act now. This incident threatens to undo everything we've worked for." Ethan joined the meeting as an advisor, his presence immediately commanding the room's attention. "The first step," he said, "is transparency. The community needs to see that you're taking this seriously. That means addressing it publicly, owning up to any mistakes, and committing to making it right." Monroe glanced at Lucas. "You're the face of reform here, Bradley. I want you to lead this effort." Lucas's stomach sank. The idea of standing before a crowd of angry residents, defending a department he still struggled to trust himself, was daunting. But he knew he couldn't back down. "I'll do it," he said, his voice resolute. At the town hall that evening, the atmosphere was charged with tension. Residents packed the community center, their voices echoing off the walls as they demanded accountability. Lucas stepped onto the stage, his heart pounding. He glanced at Ethan, who gave him a subtle nod of encouragement. "Good evening," Lucas began, his voice steady despite the weight of the room's energy. "My name is Lucas Bradley, and I'm here to address the incident that's brought us together tonight." He paused, letting his words settle. "What happened in that video was unacceptable. As an officer, I've been where Officer Mason was, making decisions in the heat of the moment. But I've also learned that those decisions have consequences. Consequences that ripple through our entire community. I'm not here to defend what happened. I'm here to acknowledge it and to commit to doing better." The crowd murmured, some skeptical, others intrigued. "We've already begun an internal review," Lucas continued. "But beyond that, we're implementing immediate changes. Every officer will undergo additional de-escalation training starting this week. And we're inviting members of this community to participate in that training so we can learn together." A man in the audience stood up. "Why should we believe you this time?" he demanded. Lucas met his gaze. "Because I've been where you are," he said simply. "I've been angry, frustrated, and tired of feeling like nothing ever changes. But I've also seen what's possible when we work together. This isn't just about promises, it's about action. And I'm asking you to hold me accountable for that action." After the meeting, Lucas stayed behind to answer questions and listen to concerns. Ethan observed quietly, impressed by Lucas's composure and sincerity. "You're starting to sound like a real leader," Ethan said as they walked out of the building together. Lucas chuckled, the tension in his chest finally easing. "I've had a good teacher." Ethan smiled but turned serious. "This is a turning point, Lucas. If we handle this right, we can solidify the progress we've made. But if we don't," Lucas nodded, "I know, we can't afford to fail." In the weeks that followed, the precinct worked tirelessly to rebuild trust. The de-escalation training sessions, co-led by community members, became a space for honest dialogue and shared learning. Officer Mason, though initially resistant, began to show signs of growth under Lucas's mentorship. The incident that had threatened to tear the community apart instead became a catalyst for deeper understanding and reform. For Lucas, it was a powerful reminder of how much work still lay ahead, but also of how far they had come. One evening, as Lucas and Ethan reflected on the past few weeks over coffee, Ethan leaned back in his chair, a rare moment of relaxation crossing his face. "You've come a long way, Lucas," he said. Lucas smiled faintly. "We both have, but this isn't the end, is it?" Ethan shook his head. "Not even close." A year after the confrontation at the town hall, The changes in the community were undeniable. The precinct had become a model of reform, with its programs being replicated in cities across the country. Trust between the police and residents was slowly rebuilding, not perfect, but growing stronger every day. Lucas Bradley, once just another name in a long list of officers, had become a symbol of change. He was no longer seen as the cop who made a mistake, but as the man who took responsibility and helped lead a movement toward accountability. One crisp autumn morning, Lucas was preparing for another community training session when Ethan Wallace called him with unexpected news. "I've been offered a position in Washington," Ethan said, his voice steady but tinged with emotion. "A leadership role in a national task force on policing reform. It's a big step, but it means leaving the community behind." Lucas felt a pang of sadness. Ethan had been his anchor, his guide through the storm of self-reflection and growth. "You have to take it," Lucas said after a moment. "You've always said this was bigger than us. Now's your chance to prove it." Ethan was quiet for a moment before responding. "I knew you'd say that, and you're right. But this doesn't mean I'm stepping away from what we've built here. It just means I'm expanding it." "Good," Lucas said with a small smile, "because I'm not done here yet." At Ethan's farewell gathering held in the community center where so much of their work had started, residents, officers, and leaders came together to honor his contributions. The room was filled with heartfelt speeches and gratitude, but it was Lucas's words that carried the most weight. "When I first met Ethan, I was a man who thought I had all the answers," Lucas said, his voice steady but thick with emotion. "But he taught me that true leadership isn't about having answers, it's about asking the right questions. It's about listening, learning, and being willing to admit when you're wrong." He paused, glancing at Ethan, who stood quietly to the side. "Ethan, you didn't just help me become a better officer. You helped me become a better person, and while we'll miss you here, I know you'll continue to inspire change wherever you go." The room erupted into applause, and Ethan stepped forward, shaking Lucas's hand firmly. "This isn't goodbye," Ethan said, his voice carrying the warmth of their shared journey. "It's just the next chapter." With Ethan's departure, Lucas found himself stepping into a new role as the unofficial face of reform within the precinct. He continued to mentor younger officers, sharing his story and encouraging them to approach their work with empathy and fairness. He also worked closely with community leaders to address lingering concerns and ensure the programs they had built remained strong. One day, during a routine meeting with a group of residents, a teenage girl approached Lucas with a hesitant smile. "Officer Bradley," she began, clutching a notebook to her chest, "I'm doing a school project on people who've made a difference in our community. Can I interview you?" Lucas blinked, taken aback. "Me? Why me?" The girl smiled. "Because you didn't give up. You made things better for all of us." Lucas felt a lump rise in his throat. "I'd be honored," he said quietly. Ethan's work in Washington quickly gained momentum. His leadership on the National Task Force led to groundbreaking recommendations on policing policies, many of which were adopted by departments across the country. He and Lucas kept in touch, often exchanging updates and ideas for how to keep pushing forward. On one call, Ethan shared a poignant thought. "You know, Lucas, if someone had told me a year ago that we'd be here, me in D.C., you leading a precinct revolution, I wouldn't have believed them." Lucas chuckled. "Neither would I. But it's proof that change is possible, even when it seems impossible." Years later, as Lucas prepared to retire from the force, he was asked to give one final speech at the precinct. Officers, community members, and even Captain Monroe gathered to celebrate his career and the impact he had made. Standing at the podium, Lucas took a deep breath, the weight of his journey settling over him. "When I started this job, I thought being a good officer was about enforcing the law," he said. "But over the years, I've learned it's about much more than that. It's about serving people, building trust, and being willing to change when you realize you're wrong." He glanced at the faces in the crowd, many of whom had been part of the journey with him. "I'm proud of what we've accomplished together, but I also know the work isn't done. It never will be. Change isn't a destination, it's a journey. And my hope is that each of you will carry that spirit forward in every decision you make and every life you touch." The applause was thunderous, and as Lucas stepped down, he felt a deep sense of fulfillment. That evening, as he sat on a bench in Montgomery Park, the same bench where everything had begun, Lucas reflected on his journey. The park was quiet, the air crisp with the promise of a new season. He pulled out a book, letting its familiar weight settle in his hands, and smiled. Change, he realized, wasn't just about fixing what was broken. It was about building something better, one step at a time. What do you think? Does this story show that even small steps can lead to big changes? Let us know in the comments, and don't forget to like, subscribe, and join us again for more stories from elderly wisdom.